Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. It has been said that the defining issue of international relations in the 21st century is the rivalry between a rising China and a ruling United States, with the battlefront being the struggle to secure the commanding heights of the new technologies that will either drive or destroy our respective economies. The question before the world is whether this rivalry will lead to a violent confrontation. We're very much honored to have with us to examine this important issue the Honorable Kevin Rudd, who can indeed offer us a special perspective. Kevin Rudd served as Prime Minister of Australia, having 2 stints in that role from 2007 to 2010, and again from June to September 2013, where he led a Labour government. He also served as the Australian Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012. Our guest has been a long-term student of China. Mandarin speaking, he is an old China hand. As a young Australian Foreign Service officer in the 1980s, he served in China. During his tenure as Prime Minister in 2010, he hosted China's strongman, Xi Jinping, to a 5-day visit. We're pleased to welcome Kevin Rudd to this table. Now, Kevin, what is it exactly that the West has to fear from a rising China?
Well, if by the West we mean the United States, or we mean the United States and Europe, it's important to define our terms. In the case of the US, where I think the two countries potentially collide, is over the question of who is the preeminent geopolitical power in East Asia. China has made no bones about the fact that it wants to see an end to US alliances in East Asia, those with Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and instead would prefer for the United States to retreat to the other side of the Pacific, east of Guam, ideally east of Hawaii. Now, I'm not putting words into China's mouth. This is what China has said through repeated statements. So assuming our friends in Washington do not want that to happen, we therefore have a collision point. This has not resulted in a hot conflict yet, but the sharp elbows that we see in the South China Sea and over questions concerning Taiwan and the East China Sea are about that primary strategic contradiction. So does the United States have something to fear on that score? Well, the bottom line is China represents a genuine geopolitical challenge.
Now, a political historian at Harvard named Graham Allison, as you know, has coined the term Thucydides' trap. And you have spoken a number of times at West Point, Annapolis, and other venues about this Thucydides' trap. And perhaps you can explain that to us.
Well, it goes back, of course, to the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. And I know Graham Allison well from Harvard. I spent a year up there with him before I came down here to New York to become president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. In a nutshell, the historian Thucydides, looking at what unfolded in the Peloponnesian Wars, said it was the rise of Athens and the fear this created in Sparta that made war inevitable. Now, there's a whole debate amongst Greek lexicographers as to whether inevitable is precisely translated, but it's probably rendered as pretty damn near unavoidable.
More likely than not.
More likely than not, certainly.
Now, of course, we get into a war with China. This would be a catastrophe, and I'm sure neither China nor the U.S. wants a war. So how do we avoid our Greek destiny and get out of the Thucydides trap?
Well, the first thing is it ain't a Greek destiny. Graham Allison, to give him credit, has looked at 16 historical case studies over the last 500 years, and 12 out of 16 have resulted in war, but 4 have not. And it's worth paying attention, therefore, to those which did not result in fully armed conflict. I think in the case of the United States and China, the answer longer term lies in a very clear analysis of understanding the core interests of the two countries which are irreconcilable, understanding those which are capable of mutual management, and understanding those interests where in fact there is a commonality of view. Take, for example, long-term management of climate change. Now, if you can have a discipline between the two countries which is capable of categorizing interests along those lines. The simple logic is you maximize cooperation on the first, that is areas where you can cooperate, be it climate change or North Korea. In the difficult areas like Taiwan, then you manage it. And in the irreconcilable questions such as China's future as a one-party state, you let, frankly, events of themselves determine what the future outcome will be. If, however, you decide to roll all those three baskets into one and say these two countries, cultures and civilizations are fundamentally irreconcilable, then you will start careering in the direction of what Thucydides made by way of his observation on Athens and Sparta all those centuries ago.
Well, has Washington under Donald Trump shown any inclination to curtail the effects of climate change? Indeed, he recently said in his speech that what do we do when all the windmills stop blowing and there's no wind, all the televisions go out? And we certainly can't stand having all the televisions go out.
Well, of course, President Trump is acting in absolute defiance of established scientific fact. It's not my opinion, it's not Jim's opinion, it's not Donald's opinion. It's what the universal consensus is of the scientific community in the United States, in Australia, and the People's Republic of China, worldwide, that global warming is occurring as a result of human activity. So to answer your question, the Trump administration, of course, has run a million miles from further action on global climate change measures. But I do not believe that's an enduring position of the United States. You just have to sense the groundswell of opinion in this country, and I think in many countries around the world where the rising generation of Americans who see the impact of climate change within their lifetimes, and certainly within their kids' lifetimes, are going to be driven towards the sorts of action we saw initiated in the Obama administration. In Beijing, the view on climate change having been for many years, I would say, almost as denialist as President Trump. As of about 2000...
Even putting out fake news about the extent of pollution in Beijing.
All that sort of stuff. But as of about 2009, something funny happened, Jim, and that is the Chinese people rose up and said, we don't want cities where we can't breathe, thank you very much. And this particulate matter in the atmosphere, which makes it impossible to breathe in Beijing for X days a year. By the way, that's the stuff that's creating greenhouse gas emissions and therefore global warming as well. So the Chinese government, based in part on scientific opinion but also popular discontent, has decided to take action. Chinese actions aren't perfect, but at least you see a trend line whereby measures for renewable energy, measures to begin to curtail coal, and other measures concerning energy efficiency are beginning to take hold. So as a global area for collaboration, China is the world's #1 emitter, 25% of global emissions. The good old US of A comes in second with 13. Historically, you've always been the largest. And therefore, these two countries have a global responsibility, apart from a mutually shared interest, to act. And I think that will transcend party politics in this country over time.
So what do we do about the Paris Accords, which seemed to be a step in the right direction, and the U.S. was on board under the Obama administration, and then Trump pulled away from it?
Well, it's interesting if you look at the detail of the Paris Agreement, is that the Trump administration has made a lot of noise about it, but so far as I'm aware, has not formally severed its obligations under that particular agreement. But the Paris Agreement of itself, if every country did what it agreed to in Paris, adds up to about 1/3 of the amount of greenhouse gas reduction we need globally in order to keep temperature increases this century within 2 degrees centigrade. And that's the limit which the climate scientists tell us we need to keep within. Otherwise, the entire ecosystem start going so fundamentally out of whack, crops not being able to be planted, bugs are rising in parts of the world where they've never been before. The global food supply, for example, begins being affected.
So let's look a little more closely at China. In the past 40 years, we've witnessed explosive growth. 40 years ago, perhaps you had 90% of the people of China living on $2 a day. Today, 99% are above the poverty level. Now, that's a good thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. I've been a huge supporter over many, many years of China's modernization campaign and the progressive liberalization of its economy, begun by Deng in 1978, and the Chinese celebrated the 40th anniversary of that at the end of last year. So
now Deng's standard was abide and hide. The China government should not make a big deal of itself all over the world, but they should slowly and incrementally grow and not attract too much attention to themselves. It's sort of the Chinese motto, I think, which is the tallest tree is the one that attracts the lightning. They didn't want to attract the lightning, but Xi Jinping seems to be quite different, doesn't he?
Well, Jim, your observations are right. Deng Xiaoping was a wise old bird. He was certainly the guy running China when I was posted there first by the Australian government as a young diplomat. And to observe what he did then, to modernise the economy, but internationally say to the world, we don't represent a threat to anybody. And the expression he said was, hide your strength, bide your time, and the third phrase I always thought was really interesting, never take the lead. 绝不当头, as the Chinese. And then Xi Jinping arrives. And as of about 2014, there's this major conference at the end of that year on the country's future foreign policy direction and international security policy direction. And they change. And basically what you see from that point on is a much more activist, loud and proud, if you like, Chinese international policy. We've seen that in the South China Sea, we've seen the Belt and Road Initiative, we've seen it with the China 2025 strategy on high tech. It's a big difference.
Well, just to tick them off, they're now the #1 trading partner of all Asian nations. By 2025, they will be the dominant power in 10 leading technologies. By 2035, the innovation leader in all advanced technologies. And by 2049, they're projected to be the leader in everything. They'll overtake us. Doesn't that worry you?
Well, what worries me fundamentally is the impact which a globally dominant China has on the norms of the international order. Up until now, China's been prepared to basically play within the rules of the existing order. That existing order was effectively laid down by the United States and its allies in 1945 after the last World War. What we begin to see, however, is China not just prepared to operate productively and profitably within that system, but China now pushing much more forcefully in different directions, which begin to suggest that different norms should prevail. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative is not subject to the sort of governance arrangements that the World Bank would put in place, or the Asian Development Bank. And therefore, there is equally an argument that China's national science and technology strategy, called China 2025, in fact exists in partial defiance of WTO, World Trade Organization provisions as well.
Well, they're in defiance of WTO provisions in a lot of ways, aren't they? I mean, forced technology transfer, IP theft, and proceedings have been brought, and they've never really been resolved, and they continue to steal our technology.
Which is why President Trump, in my judgment, should be commended for taking the argument up to China. And that's why we've had this protracted dispute now over about a year and a half called the trade war. But it's in fact about trade, technology, and intellectual property protection, and frankly the entire fabric of the US-China economic relationship. We'll know soon enough whether in fact there's a landing point in these negotiations. But it's not just about the mechanical reduction in the size of the bilateral trade deficit between the US and China, despite the fact that's very big. It's about these other structural questions alive.
Now, Australia has been something of a laboratory for US foreign policy on China. Recently, you've had two dust-ups, at least two.
Only two.
Only two. With Huawei, the Chinese technology company, which they say exports spyware with its product. And your successor, Scott Morrison, banned Huawei from Australia. And then there was the dust-up over the Chinese wanting to install military installations on the nearby island of Vanuatu, northeast of Australia. So are we seeing a pushback against the creeping expansionism of China, which evidences this Thucydides trap we've talked about?
I think Australian governments, both Labor and Conservative, have been generally fairly robust in their dealings with China. When I was Prime Minister, we took a decision to ban Huawei from providing hardware into the Australian national broadband network. We also prevented China from making investments in a whole range of sensitive strategic industries in Australia. And so we've had our range of disagreements with Beijing over a long period of time. My experience of dealing with China, however, is so long as your position is principled and consistent, and you argue it in terms of not just your own national interests, but the reciprocal interests of the Chinese, then the Chinese won't like it when you say no to a particular proposal of theirs, but they'll respect it. China ultimately respects strength and is contemptuous of weakness. On the current Huawei dispute concerning 5G, I'm 5 years out of office. I ain't seen the intelligence briefs, so it would be beyond my pay scale to comment cogently on this most recent
But you can draw certain inferences. 5G is the fifth generation of technology.
No, I understand fully what 5G is, but the particular application of what Huawei has in its technology box against leakage back to the Chinese state and security apparatus, that's something I'm not briefed on. On the particular applications concerning our national broadband network, I was briefed on and we took appropriate action. But I think it's important to consider these things separately.
Well, Huawei has certainly gotten into hot water with the United States. The daughter of the founder has been arrested in Canada. We want to extradite her and try her either for dealing with the Iranians or whatever else. Huawei has sued the United States government in Texas, saying that our own ban of Huawei is unfair. And I don't know how far they'll get with that because we've stated national security concerns. And Huawei is a state-owned enterprise. This is one of the core reasons to be worried about China, because so much of their business operates at the direction of the state.
Well, you're absolutely right in terms of the centrality of state direction for most Chinese businesses. And it's basically a graduated scale from state-owned enterprises down to semi-private firms, down to private firms. And certainly, and you referred before to China's 2025 technology strategy, which is to dominate the span of new technology industries by mid-century, and of which they see artificial intelligence as right out there, but also 5G as one of them as well. So this is part of China's state plan. On the particular actions which the United States Department of Justice has taken against Madam Meng, the Huawei executive and daughter of the founder of the company, and the extradition which they've sought from Canada, I've got to say I've got a few questions in my own head, though, about what it's ultimately all about. If, as you said before, Jim, it's about a violation of sanctions towards Iran, then the question I have is, have all other foreign nationals guilty of or suspected of violating US sanctions against Iran, have they been the subject of parallel extradition procedures around the world? I'm not certain about that. If it's some other matter concerning their dealings with, transparent dealings with international banks acting in turn as conduits to Iran, well, that's a different matter. But when you have the President of the United States say, hey, the Madam Meng matter and the Huawei matter is just all wrapped up with the trade negotiations, that is what we're trying to do to reduce the trade deficit, you have a little bit of sympathy for the Chinese scratching their heads as to what ultimately this one is about, and whether it's being, shall we say, executed in a manner which is completely consistent with what the Department of Justice would do with all similar cases? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I think there was one other case where they were successful in banning a Chinese company from the United States because of national security concerns. But the Chinese have retaliated against the Canadians for arresting Madame Meng, and they say they'll no longer import cornola. They'll have to get it somewhere else. And this is kind of typical of China, isn't it, where they ban products from certain countries because they don't like their internal actions or their law enforcement actions, isn't it?
Very much so. We've seen a history of this.
Salmon in
Norway.
In Norway, yes.
No, I remember well the case in relation to Norway. The Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded a Chinese dissident, Liu Xiaobo, the Peace Prize. Well, that sent our friends in Beijing completely bananas. And as a result, Norway was put into the deep freeze literally for about 5 years. And we see something similar emerging with Canada. Of, I think, greater concern in relation to Canada has been the arrest of 2 Canadian nationals and a threat to a 3rd Canadian national who is currently in jail in China on drugs charges. And I become deeply concerned about these individuals possibly becoming, pawns in a much bigger diplomatic and political battle with the United States.
Well, if Madame Meng is extradited to the United States, are U.S. executives in danger of being arrested on business trips to China?
I think each large corporation would need to consult their own risk analysts about their profile, their connection with the US government, and the nature of their future activities in China in order to make a properly informed judgment. Certainly these Canadian individuals have been taken in when they least expected any such possibility. I keep going back to the core point, Jim, on the Madame Meng matter, is if this is ultimately about Huawei or one of its suppliers and Madame Meng as an executive breaching US sanctions against Iran, then the critical question for the Department of Justice to answer is, has this been the procedure followed in terms of seeking extradition, etc., with all other foreign nationals who are alleged to have breached US unilateral sanctions against Iran? If not, then the question arises as to why, and why, therefore, is Huawei being singled out?
Certainly I know of no other case that's much like this one.
Well, I don't, and I follow this reasonably closely. The DOJ may well have an answer, which I'm unfamiliar with. But I think if you're going to go down this road, it has to be a consistent road.
Kevin, for 40 years, the United States pursued a policy toward China of strategic engagement. I remember hearing Henry Kissinger say, why should we rock the boat in the relationship? Then we did a pivot and we talked about strategic competition. Now, what does strategic competition involve? Does that mean somehow or other trying to put a lid on China's progress as a nation?
Well, strategic competition was first articulated by the National Security Statement of the United States, put out, I think, from memory, November, December of 2017. H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor of the United States, coordinated an interagency process in Washington which brought this out. And you see a further articulation of it in a speech in, I think, October last year by Vice President Pence at the Hudson Institute, where he outlines what he sees to be the principles of this new strategic competition. As I've read both documents, it's still a little unclear in my mind as to what the parameters are. If it is, as some within the administration indicate, an attempt to draw a line around various Chinese international activities, like in the South China Sea, like in the East China Sea, threats towards Taiwan, China 2025 on the economy, and BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, then the United States needs to work out fairly rapidly what its response is in each of those circumstances.
So, unfortunately, we're running out of time rapidly, but I have a question for you, and that is a military confrontation with China inevitable?
It's not inevitable, and something I'm writing at the moment called the avoidable war. There is a way through this thing, but you know, as the years roll by, it's getting a little harder. You know something? Hawks have been empowered in both capitals, Beijing and Washington. And you know what hawks are like? They're nothing that they like better than ramping it up even further. And that's where I become quite anxious about conflict through miscalculation, through a single incident then becoming massively inflamed and escalating. We're still a way through, and I think women and men of goodwill in both capitals will be working hard on that.
Well, you remember Giraudoux wrote a play called The Trojan War Will Not Take Place. We saw it here as Tiger at the Gates, where everyone thought the Trojan War would never happen, and yet it happened anyway. So, Kevin Rudd, thank you so much for coming by.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
It's been marvelous, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.